Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, an episode on Armenian political parties. So today's episode was requested by VV, Kyle Matthew Lamberty, and Leo Sharman. If you want me to do another country's political parties, please either comment it down below, send me an email, send me a message on Patreon from my patrons, thanks to them and especially Danny Brown by the way, or send me a request on my feedback and request form in the description. I currently have requests to do Mexican parties, Czech parties, Iraqi parties, Thai parties, Singaporean parties, Norwegian parties, Swedish parties, Lithuanian parties, Finnish parties, Greenlandic parties, and many more. Armenian politics for many years was very similar to other ex-USSR countries. It was run by several non-ideological or just vaguely conservative/nationalistic strongmen with limited opposition allowed to exist. This, however, started to change in 2018 after the Velvet Revolution. The opposition was brought into power and was able to move the country towards a more liberal democracy. However, war with its neighbor, Azerbaijan, in 2020 and 2023 that saw the Armenian Republic of Artsakh dissolved and Nagorno-Karabakh see its Armenian population cleansed, the government failing to fulfill reforms and accusations of corruption and cracking down on political opponents have led to optimism about the future of Armenian democracy to be muted. Armenian parties are somewhat similar to Ukrainian parties. Both countries have a similar-ish political party history if you squint a little bit. Most of the parties have a somewhat vague ideology, and geopolitical allegiance plays a fairly big role in party identity, at the very least identifying it to an outside observer. Armenia's main legislative body is the National Assembly, which is made up currently of 107 deputies. The deputies are elected via proportional representation, with a party needing to win 4% of the vote in order to pass the electoral threshold, while a coalition of parties needs 7% of the vote. Although there are several quirks Armenia's National Assembly has. First off, 4 seats are reserved for ethnic minorities in the country, the Yazidis, Assyrians, Kurds, and Russians. Secondly, while 101 deputies are always going to be elected, depending on the electoral math at the end of the election, extra MPs may be elected in order to level out and ensure proportionality after the election. Lastly, regardless of the results, 3 electoral blocks have to be elected into the National Assembly, even if they fall short of the threshold. So theoretically, if Party A gets 80% of the vote, Party B gets 15% of the vote, Party C gets only 1% of the vote, and the rest is divided between a dozen or so different parties, Party C, despite getting very few votes, could get elected. The National Assembly votes on rules and regulations, will elect the Prime Minister, the most powerful political figure in Armenia, their cabinet, and the president. I also want to note before we begin, the last election saw the biggest political blocs form around political coalitions made up of various parties. However, all of these coalitions were de facto controlled by a single political party, and it's not really worth it to touch up on all these smaller parties that made up a coalition, so I'll just really base this episode around the leading party of the coalition, and also make a brief note of its coalition allies. So the ruling party is currently the Civil Contract Party, or KP. KP was founded in 2015 to serve as a political vehicle for its leader, Nikol Pashinyan, at the time journalist and opposition figure, fighting for a more open, less corrupt, and democratic Armenia. It managed to make some minor electoral gains over the next couple years. In 2018, it was the leading force in the Velvet Revolution. Elections later that year saw KP win over 70% of the vote, with Pashinyan brought into power, and he has served as prime minister since. KP has dominated Armenia and Armenian politics in the new post-Velvet Revolution environment, although it has more recently seen its dominance challenged more and more. KP has broadly been defined as a liberal party in the international press, although it also could be defined as populist, centrist, and having a non-ideological party of power ideology. It generally does best among those involved in civil society, those in the capital Yerevan, among those sympathetic towards a reformist agenda, and seemingly among Armenia's ethnic minorities, seeing as many of the reserve seats in the National Assembly are held by KP members. It's overall the party for Pashinyan supporters, and as I'll talk about later, voters fearful of a return to the previous Republican government. It currently has 70 deputies. KP was famously vague when it entered into office, only clearly being opposed to corruption in the country and hinting at moving towards the West. It has sought to crack down on corruption, reforming the government and the army to be more effective, supports broadly center-right economics, wanting to break up state monopolies and supporting a flat tax, wants to double Armenia's population, and wants to improve infrastructure in the country. In terms of foreign policy, it generally gets labeled as a pro-EU party, although that's not really the whole story. It has somewhat gone back and forth, but Generally, the line from the party and Pashinyan is it wants to continue to maintain good ties with Russia, while also expanding out and building up friendly relations with the EU, America, and Iran. It has, with the past year, leaned more into the pro-EU rhetoric, freezing its membership in the CSTO and announcing it would be in the process of joining the EU. Pashinyan and KP's biggest failure has to be its defeat in the 2020 war. It was under Pashinyan's watch that the Armenians lost Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan was given control of the region, with over 100,000 Armenians forced out of the area. Pashinyan has tried to set up peace agreements with Azerbaijan and Turkey, which have led to a lot of the opposition, particularly the nationalist and pro-Russian opposition, to label him as an Azeri/Turk apologist, propped up by Armenia's enemies, or even just outright a traitor to Armenia. Several protests have broken out since the war, calling for Pashinyan to step down. While the 2021 election saw the majority of the electorate still back Pashinyan, and protests have failed to draw up enough support to drive KP from office, they are able to pull a decent chunk of the Armenian people to them, and the 2021 election saw some opposition figures decry the election process. Seeing as protests have increased, Pashinyan has taken on a more restrictive role in the country, cracking down on speech that promotes dissent against him, and removing an opposition politician from office in one case, which hurts his reformist credentials. Pashinyan has also been accused of being a puppet of the West by pro-Russian groups for wanting to move towards the EU, while some pro-EU groups see him as non-committal towards liberal reform. As I've kind of hinted at, KP, like a lot of Armenian parties, doesn't really have a firm ideology, so there's a bit of a sense that it doesn't really have any actual policy goals, rather just trying to be elected and support Pashinyan. KP and Pashinyan remain still the largest political force in Armenia, and debatably the most popular, but Pashinyan's support is most likely decreasing, and his position as the head of the country is slowly slipping. Also, KP works with the United Labour Party, or MAC. MAC was founded in 2002 by Gugen Arsenian, a businessman. Arsenian led the party into the 2003 election, managing to win a decent 5.5% of the vote. However, it fell into irrelevancy after that and remained out of the National Assembly for over a decade. In the 2021 election, it decided to join forces with KP, running on the same electoral list and managing to win a seat. Arsenian remains the head of the party and currently is the Armenian ambassador to Russia and former deputy, resigning his seat when he took the ambassador job. If another member of MAC will take his place remains to be seen, the MAC will continue to provide support, if only very minor, to the KP government. Let's go to the opposition, with the largest opposition party being the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, or Dashkan Syunyun, or ARF. The ARF is a very old party, being founded in 1890 by Armenian intellectuals. It was a nationalist/socialist party in the vein of many other national parties in Eastern Europe. It wanted a homeland for the Armenian people, with that either being an independent Armenia or an autonomous region with left-leaning economics hostile towards non-Armenian landlords who they felt lorded over the poorer Armenian peasantry. It quickly grew into a powerful player in the Armenian community, playing a major role in the First Armenian Republic after World War I. However, with the Armenian genocide and the Soviet takeover of the country, the ARF was forced out and went into exile. After Armenia regained its independence in the 90s, it re-emerged as an important player in the country's politics. It, while never a leading player, did serve as a coalition partner in several governments over the years until the Velvet Revolution. In the 2018 election, it lost its parliamentary representation. However, in the 2021 election, it led the Armenian alliance with several other parties and Robert Kocharian, the president of Armenia from 1998 to 2008. The alliance managed to become the second biggest force in Armenia, with the ARF being the only party to win deputies from the alliance. It today represents those with ties to the historic ARF, those sympathetic towards center-left economics, and broadly those upset with the Pashinyan's governments, viewing him as a traitor. While the opposition against Pashinyan is diverse, a large chunk of the opposition is made up of refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh and are members of the clergy and Armenian church. So the ARF support base likely consists of a decent number of those people. The ARF has 29 affiliated deputies. It is currently headed by Ishan Sakatelyev, a deputy and former regional governor. I'll also note really briefly, the ARF is very much a worldwide force, less as a political party, and more as a cultural organization among the Armenian diaspora. However, actually in Lebanon, it is a pretty popular electoral force among the Armenian community, typically able to elect a couple members to Lebanese parliament. The ARF can broadly be defined as nationalistic, friendly with Russia, and backs more government investment. It wants more investment in the healthcare and agricultural industries, and more government support to small and medium-sized businesses. It has historically favored a united Armenia, with Nagorno-Karabakh as officially joined with Armenia, although with Nagorno-Karabakh now under Azeri control, I'm not sure if it still holds this position. It, however, is in favor of more government investment into cultural affairs, wants to discourage immigration out of the country, and supports reparations from Turkey for the Armenian genocide. It tends to be viewed as a pro-Russia party, favoring Armenia to maintain friendly ties with Russia, and Kochanian has been a vocal Putin supporter, even favoring crackdowns on foreign NGOs, which tends to be viewed by the international press as limiting Western influence in the country. The ARF and the Armenian alliance also backs more digitization, wants to professionalize the army, invest more in veteran benefits, and crack down on corruption. The ARF is historically a very important force in Armenia, but its historical prevalence hasn't translated to electoral support. The ARF has just never been able to muster up that much support in order to take control. They have, however, played a role in several governments in the 2000s and 2010s with the ruling Republican Party. This has made them seen as allies to the old government, which resulted in many reformist and liberally minded Armenians to distrust them and view them as a puppet of the Republican government. It did do decently well in the 2021 election, becoming the biggest opposition party, but its pro-Russian stance means many in Armenia view them as a Russian puppet. Russia is blamed by a decent chunk of the Armenian public for the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh. Seeing as Russia backed away from the country after Pashinyan was elected, Kochanian's role in the Armenian alliance also has likely turned off some voters, seeing as Kochanian's rule was seen as quite undemocratic. Kochanian also had his bodyguard kill a former classmate for saying hi to him in 2001, and is allegedly the mastermind behind an infamous terrorist act in 1999, which saw several high-ranking politicians assassinated in Armenian parliament. I've hinted at them throughout the episode, so now let's turn to the Republican Party, or the HHK. The HHK is not as old as the ARF, but it's relatively old for an Armenian party, being founded in the 90s right before Armenian independence. It came to represent Armenian nationalist and right-leaning forces in the country. It was involved in the first governments, albeit as a minor player. However, after the 1999 election, the HHK emerged as a dominant party, and from 1999 to 2018, it effectively dominated politics in the country. Starting in 2008, Serge Sargsyan would lead the party and country up until the Velvet Revolution, which saw Sargsyan and the party overthrown and removed from power. It would, in the 2021 election, cooperate together with the small Homeland Party in the I Have Honor alliance. It failed to pass the threshold for coalitions, but due to Armenia's three-block rule, the HHK was able to get several members elected. The HHK still is a vaguely right-wing party, but it also has just been defined as a pro-Russian party and a party based around those who support and back Sargsyan, mainly those who benefited under his rule, like wealthy businessmen and civil servants. It currently has 6 affiliated deputies. Sargsyan is currently a deputy. HHK, like a lot of Armenian parties, has a somewhat vague policy, but it does define itself as a national conservative party on its website. It socially supports the Armenian church being supported and propped up by the state, supports the traditional family, and wants to encourage more connections with the Armenian diaspora and the motherland. It says it favors a liberal economic model, balancing entrepreneurship with social responsibility. It has generally supported Russia, favoring closer relations and even calling for a union state between Armenia and Russia, like Belarus's relationship with Russia, and opposes further connections with the EU. While the HHK was in charge, it sought to crack down on corruption and open up civil society a little more. But this doesn't mean it didn't brutally crack down on its opponents. Sargsyan's first presidential election in 2008 saw protests that were crushed by the police, with around 10 people killed. HHK's rule saw corruption continue to plague the country as rich oligarchs became some of the prime backers of Sargsyan and his allies. Supporters of the EU and the West also viewed Armenia under the HHK as a puppet of Russia. All of this and Sargsyan attempting to retain his power by altering the Armenian constitution to give much of the presidency's power over to the prime minister, which he was going to transition to at the end of his presidential reign, led to massive protests which became the Velvet Revolution. The party after the revolution was crushed and its reputation deeply hurt. While the opposition has seen a surge of support in recent years with the fall of the Republic of Artsakh, most opposition supporters will most likely turn towards other parties that are without the baggage of the HHK. Even this last election, when they were resurgent, they were only able to enter into the National Assembly due to no other party crossing the electoral threshold. While the desire for a conservative pro-Russian force almost certainly exists in Armenia, it wouldn't surprise me if soon a new party emerges to take this banner away from the HHK. So those are all the parties in the National Assembly, but I thought I'd take a brief tour of some of the other smaller parties that exist in Armenia. Most of these parties have 2 flavors. Firstly, you have the vaguely pro-EU liberals. They tend to be divided on Pashinyan's government, with some seeing him as a liberal trying to push Armenia towards the EU in his own way, while others view him as either too soft on Russia/corruption or too incompetent. You have groups like the Bright Armenia Party, the third most voted for party in 2018 but has been on a decline since, the National Progress, and Harun Tutuv Party, who both have a presence in the Yerevan City Council, Remgavar, a liberal party tracing its origins to the First Armenian Republic, and other groups like the Armenian National Congress and European Party of Armenia. Secondly, you have vaguely pro-Russian conservative and nationalist types. Some notable parties are the Mother Armenia Alliance and Public Voice parties, with both holding a presence in the Yerevan City Council, the Tavush for the Homeland, headed by Primate Bagrat Galistan, a leading opposition and religious figure, and the Prosperous Armenia Party, a conservative party based in Kotayak that was historically fairly important, being the second largest party in the country from 2007 until the 2021 election, when it became the fourth most voted for group and lost its parliamentary representation. Outside these groups, you have the Snare Pan-Armenian Party, a hard-right Armenian nationalist party that, interestingly enough, is pro-EU, the Armenian Communist Party, a post-Soviet Marxist party that briefly had some influence in the 90s but now remains on the fringe, and the People's Party of Armenia, a leftist party that initially worked a bit with the HHK in the 90s and 2000s until it fell into irrelevancy. Important to note, just about all these parties, and even the largest parties we've talked about earlier, have little ideological cohesion. Many have kind of vague policy goals, will only point towards somewhat of an ideology, and generally its stance on Russia or the EU are the only thing that kind of defines them as a party, and even then it can be somewhat vague. So those are the parties of Armenia. In conclusion, you have KP, a party that has run the country since the Velvet Revolution, representing those who want Armenia to reform and turn away from Russia, either a little bit or a lot. The ARF, a historically important party representing Armenian nationalists, those friendly with Russia and those supportive of a social market economy, and the HHK, which has run the country before the Velvet Revolution and represents pro-Russian conservatives somewhat. As stated at the start, Armenia's party system is similar to Ukraine's, with vague ideologies among the parties and corruption being quite common. The big question with Armenian parties right now is what is going to happen with Pashinyan's government. Will it be overthrown by protesters? Will it lose the next election? Will it reform Armenia into a proper liberal democracy? Or will it fall into the traps of the HHK and other politicians who have run Armenia and embrace authoritarianism in order to stay in power? All this, we will just have to wait and see. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching. Up next, I'm going to do the history of Croatia. I've already kind of started research, and I found like a decent chunk of books actually at my local library, which I was a little bit surprised about, but I'm happy. I think it'll be good. I'm excited for it. And then I will do Mexican political parties, and then I will do the history of Cuba. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching. If you want, you can email me at whydocountries.exist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.